Well, good afternoon, everyone. Obviously, we'll be voting on the motion to proceed to the Sanctuary Cities bill, which my colleagues can give you greater details on. Then it's my plan to move to cybersecurity. We have an agreement to get on the bill. We have a number of amendments in the queue. This is legislation that we're confident we can pass and conference with the House and actually make some progress for the country. The big question, I guess, is whether the President will veto the defense authorization bill. He apparently says he's going to do that. I would remind you all that 73 senators voted for the bill. We hope, if there is a veto, that it comes to the Senate, because we think we have the votes to override the veto, which would be extremely important for our armed forces. With that, let me turn to Senator Cornyn.
Well, we will be voting in just a few minutes on an important piece of legislation which will determine whether the federal government is still the the laws written by the Congress are the supreme law of the land, as the Constitution says, or whether individual jurisdictions, municipalities, can in effect nullify federal law by refusing to enforce it. What this legislation does is it emphasizes that the 1996 law, which required local jurisdictions to share information about people held in their jails, that be implemented, and that detainers issued by the federal government for criminals who are held in local jails be honored. And if they don't, if some of these jurisdictions refuse to do that, then they will be denied federal funds for various purposes, not including law enforcement. So this is really a question of whether we are going to be a union, a nation, honoring our Constitution and enforcing our Constitution, or whether we're going to be a confederation of separate entities that are just somehow work together when it's convenient and don't when it's not. So this will be a very telling vote here at 2:15, and I hope our friends across the aisle do not choose to block it, which they've apparently indicated they will, but maybe they'll think twice.
Well, as the leader mentioned, later today we're going to send the President the National Defense Authorization Act, which all indications are that he will veto. It is a bill that came through the Senate in a very big bipartisan way. We had 70-plus votes here in the United States Senate for it. Similar outcome in the House of Representatives. And I think it's ironic that the President would veto that bill given what's happening in the world, because while the President has been in office on his watch, we've seen ISIS continue to gain ground and is in the process of establishing a caliphate in the Middle East. We've seen Russia and Syria form an unholy alliance in the Middle East, an area that is already filled with great tumult, and continue to exercise even greater influence there. We've seen Iran now have access to on the order of about $100 billion to finance its terrorist activities in the Middle East. So all this is going on at a time that the President is talking about vetoing the legislation that would ensure that our men and women in uniform are prepared and ready to defend our country's interest here at home and around the world. I hope the President comes to his senses and decides that's a really bad course of action for the country. It's a dangerous course of action. The world's an increasingly dangerous place in desperate need of American leadership. And we have a President who evidently is not paying attention to what's going on, because vetoing this important legislation, which passed Congress with big bipartisan margins, would be a huge mistake for America's national security interests.
What the President does seem to be paying attention to is the upcoming discussion on climate in Paris and the conference next year. Today in the Foreign Relations Committee, we'll be having a hearing this afternoon with the chief climate negotiator to those talks from the United States. This was supposed to be a combined hearing with the Environment and Public Works Committee as well as Foreign Relations Committee, but Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA, has refused to send anyone from the EPA to testify because she said that she had no one knowledgeable to be able to talk about this topic. This is the same EPA that continues with regulations that have significant impacts on jobs and our economy. Well, I can assure you that Gina McCarthy will be in Paris talking about her role and responsibility in carrying out the initiatives, but let's be very clear, Congress has a role, an oversight role, and an obligation in this. The administration, the President talks about bringing all people to the table. It's actually American taxpayer dollars that are bringing people to the table. The President has promised $3 billion, a lot of which I think is going to be used to line the pockets of bureaucrats from developing countries around the world. I think we want to make it very clear that this United States Senate will not stand with the President if he is trying to promise taxpayer dollars by binding the hands of the American people in terms of timetables, in terms of targets, without the advice and consent of the United States Senate.
Well, the administration's been incredibly aggressive in expanding their authority and going beyond the law in areas like the waters of the U.S. that now federal courts have said shouldn't be implemented yet, or the Mercury rule that 22 months after it was put in place, the Supreme Court said you don't have the right to do that. They've also been very selective in which laws they wanted to enforce. And in that environment, maybe it's no surprise that a lot of cities have decided they can be selective in which laws you want to enforce, but that's not an acceptable place for cities to be. It doesn't create the kind of environment that people need to see where the law is enforced. It doesn't follow the law in ways that require sharing of information about people that have repeatedly been detained until eventually some, in the terrible case that happened in recent months, some innocent bystander is killed by someone who over and over again has been picked up but not detained because they're in a so-called sanctuary. That's unacceptable. It's also unacceptable for those communities to continue to benefit from law enforcement assistance when they won't assist law enforcement, or those communities to benefit from other kinds of federal assistance when they won't be part of the process that the law requires. I hope we get to vote to move to this bill today. Sanctuary cities don't work. They're outside what people have every reason to believe is a reasonable place for the government of the United States or their community to be. We're going to put that question to a test.
Let me just make two additional points about the National Defense Authorization Act. Number one, the President is threatening to veto this bill in a dispute over domestic discretionary spending. We need to realize, and it needs to be reinforced, this authorization bill gives the President every penny he asks for in national defense. It matches dollar for dollar the President's request. So let's have the fight on domestic spending in another format and not put the troops and the security of our nation on hold. The other point I would make that has not been made yet about this bill, it contains a major reform to allow our younger troops to have an opportunity to contribute to retirement without serving the 20 years. We can take care of the longer serving veterans as I was taken care of as a retired Air Force officer myself. But this major reform allows people who don't want to make a 20-year career of the military to enjoy some retirement benefits also. The President, by vetoing the bill, would put a halt to this very important reform. So I am calling on the President. I hope the President will reconsider what his aides have said and will go ahead and sign this bill. Let's have the domestic fight on another piece of legislation.
Senator McConnell. Anywhere on the debt ceiling at all, sir? Anywhere at all on the debt ceiling?
Well, we're going to wait and see how the House deals with that issue, and then we'll respond accordingly.
Senator McConnell, will you rule out, though?
Well, obviously, we don't prefer a clean debt ceiling. We'll have to see what the House sends over, and we'll act accordingly.
Senator McConnell, would you rule out?
On how the election results for Canada impact the Keystone decision and discussion going forward?
Honestly, I don't know how the Canadian election affects us. it's certainly interesting, but how it might affect us, I can't imagine it's going to adversely impact the U.S.-Canada relationship. We've always had a good relationship with Canada, no matter who they elect, and they've chosen to go in a different direction. I hope the American people decide to do the same thing next year.
Senator McConnell.
Look, no matter how many times you ask me, we're going to wait and see what the House does on that subject, and then we'll act accordingly.
Has Speaker Boehner indicated to you when he plans to act and what he will act on?
You'll have to ask the House when they plan to deal with the debt ceiling issue.
Sir, how much time are you willing to give over to the cybersecurity bill?
Well, we intend to pass the cybersecurity bill. It enjoys significant bipartisan support, and we think it's important, and we intend to see it through to completion, hopefully early next week.
Senator McConnell, after the 2014 midterms, you promised that you want to show that Republicans could govern effectively and present a vision for this country. When you look at what's happening in the House right now, how much concern does that give you that it actually undermines what you said after the midterms?
Well, I think the Senate has demonstrated that we have a new agenda and we can pass it. You know, whether it's the Iran Nuclear Review Act, whether it was the rewrite of No Child Left Behind, whether it was a multi-year highway bill, whether it's something like cybersecurity. We're also going to turn to TSCA. We're here in the Senate to do serious business for the American people that can clear this body with the supermajority that is required for most things that we do. We also passed a budget. 4 of the last 5 years, the Senate under Democratic leadership didn't pass a budget. We reported out 12 appropriation bills. That hadn't happened in years. They've all been blocked by the minority, but clearly we have a serious right of center agenda here in the Senate to try to make as much progress as we can for the country, given the fact that we have a president who has very different views about what America ought to be like. Just remind you again, we've had divided government frequently in this country. In fact, we've had it most of the time, more often than not, since World War II. American people elect divided government. You have to deal with the government you have. And so what we're trying to do here in the Senate is make as much progress for the country as we can. I think it is also noteworthy that our agenda is entirely different from the agenda that we had last year. We have a different set of priorities and are pursuing different outcomes, but we are choosing to advance the cause on issues where there is at least enough bipartisan support to get it out of the Senate and hopefully to get a presidential signature. Thanks.